Good morning, Year 9, and welcome to your final lesson of history before the summer holidays. So today we are going to look at political threats from the right to the Weimar government. So last week we looked at the communist uprising, the Spartacists, and that was on the left of the political spectrum, and today we're going to look at the threats from the right. So we're going to understand what happened during the Cap and the Munich Putsch and evaluate, with bearing last week's lesson in mind, how much of a threat we think they will pose to the government. So to help us today, let's recap on what we did last week. So see if you can have a go at answering these 5 questions without looking at anything, just off the top of your head. Off you go. Let's see how you did. So when Berlin was unsafe, where did the German government move to? It was Weimar. What was the German parliament called? It was the Reichstag. Which communist group attempted to seize power in 1919? It was the Spartacists. Who led this revolt? It was Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. And which group did Eber use to help defeat the revolt? It was the Free Corps. And we are going to look at the Free Corps today, because they actually, the ones that supported Eber in 1919 against the communists and helped the government, are the ones that turn against them this week. Well, then. So just a reminder, we had this last week of the political parties. We looked at left wing and right wing. So last week we looked at the left, we looked at the communists, and we looked at the Spartacist uprising. And this week we are going to start to look at the right. So we're going to have a look at the nationalists. Now, nationalists are people, political parties that wanted a strong Germany. They wanted a strong leader. So they would have liked Kaiser Wilhelm II leading Germany. That was what suited them. They were also against democratic governments. They called them quite weak, so they really did not like the Weimar government that was in place. They were very much anti-communist, and they were really popular with the army and the middle classes. So that was like their voting basis, for the middle classes and particularly the army. And the army is really quite disgruntled at this moment in time, so they really are getting them for support. So I'm going to go through the Cap Putsch today, and also the Munich Putsch. Now, after each one, like last week, I've got the same questions. So after the Spartacist Rising, we had a set of questions about how much of a threat they were, what their aims were, why did they do it. If you want, you could pause and you could make a quick note of this kind of table, and if you want, you can do a table just to go through and make notes that way rather than answering the questions. I'm more than happy for you to do that, or if you just kind of want to make notes on each one rather than answering the set questions, that's fine as well. So I just thought I'd show you this to you in case it was a viable option for you. So we're going to look at the Cap Putsch to begin with. And this came at a time after the Treaty of Versailles was declared. So this is a putsch that was led by Wolfgang Cap, and this is him just here, as you can see, and he led the Free Corps to march in Berlin and declare a new national government. So they marched, they said, look, we're starting a new national government, you can't stop us. And he'd worked during the war with Admiral von Tirpitz, who was responsible for the increase of the navy, and he also, after the war, was one that campaigned to bring back the monarchy. So he really wanted imperialism. He wanted to have a king and a queen. And the problem was, when this Cap Putsch arrived, it was all because of the resentment with the stability of the Weimar Republic. They didn't think it was very stable, but also they were really unhappy with the Treaty of Versailles, and they were like the biggest group to be unhappy with the Treaty of Versailles. And that was partly because the army, who was seen as the, if you remember from the first lesson, I talked about how the army was the most important thing to Germany, really important thing to Kaiser Wilhelm as well, and the army was one of the big things that had restrictions placed on it from the Treaty of Versailles, because obviously the army was reduced, they weren't allowed an air force, their navy was reduced and destroyed, and so a lot of those that kind of were not allowed to now be part of the army, the demobbed soldiers as they called them, simply just joined the Free Corps. So it was a big problem, the Treaty of Versailles, and obviously with the army being one of kind of the lead voters for the nationalists, the right wing, that was why they supported Wolfgang Cap. So as I said, the Treaty of Versailles, the reduction of the army, caused a lot of tension and anger with Germany, particularly the pressure it put on the armies, and the fact that big thing. They tried to create the most powerful thing. They wanted to obviously take over the world, and that was going to be stopped. And they needed to disband the Free Corps. So they disbanded the army. They wanted to disband the Free Corps, and the leader of the Berlin Free Corps refused to disband. So they were supposed to, having the Free Corps, because they were ex-soldiers, they were classed as a military force. So to have these groups of military forces running around Germany went against the Treaty of Versailles. So the government had to kind of get rid of them, and they were happy to use them, obviously, before the Treaty of Versailles was signed, but to use them to get rid of the communists, but they needed to get rid of them. And the leader of Berlin refused to disband, and he decided that instead he wanted to control Berlin instead. So what happened? Well, around 12,000 Free Corps marched into Berlin, so there's quite a lot of them. The army for Weimar refused to actually help the government. So the army is supposed to be responding and to listen to direct instructions from the president, which at the time was Ebert, and they refused. So that causes a big problem. If you've got your hierarchy and you've got the president at the top, and then you've got the army who is meant to be under your control, and they are refusing, that is a huge issue, and that's going to cause so many problems for Germany. So they refused to help because they said they wouldn't fire on former soldiers, and the government was then forced to flee to Dresden because the army wouldn't help them. So they had to leave the capital, go somewhere else. Okay, so that's quite a big threat. The government asked the workers to go help them because they didn't have anyone else. So they kind of was like, we've got no one else, let's ask the workers and see if the workers will strike for us. And that was kind of what they had to do. They called on trade unions and the people of Berlin and said, look, can you help us? Can you help the government? Can you go on strike? So they went on strike, and it obviously brought the whole city to a standstill. So things like trams and transport, they were all stopped working because there was a strike. And therefore it made it impossible for Cap to rule, and so he didn't know what else to do. And after 4 days of this siege, he had to go, and he fled from Berlin. And nothing really happened to him. He'd obviously tried to take over the government, the country, caused this big issues. He fled, and that was it. Now, if we think about the Spartacist uprising that happened in 1919, where a very similar thing happened, except they were communist, what was the result of it? Well, over 100 communists were killed, and the 2 leaders of the party were arrested, and they died. So can we see how the government is not treating the threats from the left and the threats from the right equally? Because the government know that those in the right, so the nationalists, so like Cap, they kind of hold more of a stance in Parliament. They're the ones that are going to most likely vote for them as well. So they kind of were very careful with how they treated them, but were they perhaps too easygoing on them? And this is something I will talk a lot about next year particularly, but I just wanted to sow that seed. So what I'd like you to do is, like I said, you can do the table, you can just make notes or answer these questions, whichever is easiest for you. So pause here and do this part. I want you to briefly explain why the Free Corps wanted to overthrow the Weimar Republic, explain how the Free Corps tried to take over, what were their strengths, what were their weaknesses, and how much of a threat do you think that they pose. So the fact that maybe their weakness could be that they weren't particularly organised, they didn't actually get much support from anyone else once they started their revolt. Okay. So pause and have a go. You might want to, at the bottom of this YouTube video, are some clips that I've put as the Cap Putsch. So please have a look at them if you want as well to recap before you answer the questions, and that's fine. And the second big threat from the right-wing politician, another example, shall we say, is Adolf Hitler and General Ludendorff, who attempted the Munich Putsch. Okay, again, both Ludendorff and Adolf Hitler on the right side, nationalists, part of the Nazi Party. So this was the newly established Nazi Party. It was still quite weak. It was just beginning, a bit of a baby political party, shall we say. And next year we'll look at this a lot more. We'll look at the rise of the Nazi Party and how they started off as this quite small party. They had Hitler, they attempted this Munich Putsch, and then actually that helped them then to work on what they needed to improve on in the future to develop as a party to eventually let them seize power in 1933. We'll come off to that, don't worry. But this was Adolf Hitler, General Ludendorff, who attempted the Munich Putsch. They were going to try and make Ludendorff leader of Germany. So that's what they wanted. They wanted to make him leader of Germany because Ludendorff had played a really big role in the First World War. He was almost like seen as a war hero during the war. So they kind of thought if he's in power, people will listen to him, people will be happy. It's a bit like having Kaiser Wilhelm back in one sense. So their plan was to take over the government and then set up Ludendorff as the new leader. So why did they do it? Why 1923? And it's quite difficult in one sense because we're skipping a little bit. We're going to 1923, and a lot happened between 1919 and 1923 economically in Germany. They had the hyperinflation, which we've kind of touched upon this year, but we will go into more detail next year. But they kind of thought that now was the time because the Nazi Party was actually quite popular, and they'd started the putsch in Munich, which was in a region called Bavaria, because they thought if they start there, that's where they're going to be the most successful to begin with, and that's where the Nazi Party had the most support. So that's where they were most popular. The other thing is in Munich, in Bavaria, it was an area where there wasn't very good support for Weimar Germany. Not many people liked this Weimar Republic, and by 1923 the Nazi Party actually had, I'll write it on here, but the Nazi Party had got this isn't too bad, it's better than my other lesson, 55,000 members. Okay, so at this point we've got 55,000 members in the Nazi Party, so they were like, look how big we are, look how strong we are, this is great, we're going to do great. The other thing is that the Nazis had their own private army, so they felt that kind of gave them a bit of an edge and would help give them, they could push on because they've got this army support. So the SA was led by a guy called Major Rome, or Rom, and he served also in the First World War. He was a really experienced soldier, so they thought, well, we've got him, we've got this, we'll be fine. They also thought that they had the support of the Bavarian Prime Minister. So Gustav von Kahr was the Prime Minister, and he kind of gave off the impression that he wanted to rebel against the Weimar government. And so they thought, well, this is the time. If we say to him, look, we're going to do this, he'll probably support us. And because Kahr had the support of the army within Bavaria, he felt that this was the time to do it, this was the right time. And Hitler also believed that with the support of Kahr, of Lossow, of Ludendorff, the time was now right to launch an attack on the government. So that's why they decided now is the time. So just think here, just pause. Do you think that this was more of a threat so far than the Cap Putsch or the Spartacist Rising? Just have a pause and have a think and see what you think. So let's have a look at what actually happened. So there's two key dates, so we'll have a look. So just look out for it on the side. But on the 8th of November, so the day that it started, Hitler and 600 of his SA decided that they were going to interrupt a meeting. So there's a meeting happening in a beer hall, which is why sometimes this is called the beer hall putsch as well. And it was Gustav von Kahr, the Prime Minister, talking to about 2,000 right-wing supporters in a beer hall. So a lot of people who would have obviously supported the Nazis being right-wing possibly. So Hitler and 600 of his SA interrupted a meeting stating that they were going to start a revolution. So he's like, here I am, I'm going to start a revolution. And he decided to take Kahr and his advisor, Lossow, into a side room. And in that side room, he persuaded Kahr at gunpoint. So obviously, if you persuade someone at gunpoint, is it the same as actually getting them on board, or do they feel that they're going to support you because they'd rather do that than die? I don't think Hitler really thought that through, but he persuaded him at gunpoint to support Hitler, and said, we're going to overthrow the government, you need to help us. They agreed, and because they agreed, they were allowed to leave the beer hall. And because they left, they obviously decided that they were going to tell the authorities, which they did. So the German government responded pretty quickly. So it was in the evening, so we're kind of like overnight, we're then going into the 9th of November, the next day. And the German government decided to declare a state of emergency, and the army was ordered to crush the revolt. So they said, you know, send armed police, we need to crush what's going on. So they decided not to join the putsch, and instead they were going to say that they were opposing the putsch. So they, you know, they said, although they'd agreed to Hitler that they were going to support him, they then told the authorities, oh no, we'll support you, we'll help crush Hitler. So they backtracked very quickly. And what happened was that the Nazis started marching. So there's about 2,000-3,000, it varies in different textbooks, it's a rough figure, but they marched on Munich, ready to obviously go and take over Germany. And as they did, they were stopped by the armed police and some Bavarian soldiers. Around 100 armed police stopped the Nazis where they were, and a shot was fired. We don't know if it was the Nazis, we don't know if it was the Bavarian army, we're not particularly sure, but because one shot was fired, the police shot back. There was a very short little shooting out match, very short, only lasted about a minute, but within that 16 Nazis were shot. Ludendorff sort of continued to march towards the police. He was arrested. Hitler ran away. I say ran away, there's lots of conflicting evidence. We'll get into this a bit more next year, but he says that someone was wounded and he was trying to help him. A lot of people say he just ran away, he was a bit of a coward. So he ran away and was later found and arrested 2 days later. Now what's important are some of the consequences. Because Hitler was arrested, he was given a trial. Okay, and this trial took place in February in 1924, so just a few months later. And the trial was kind of used as a publicity stint because Hitler made all these really powerful speeches. He was accusing the Weimar government of treason. He was now seen in Germany as the natural leader of the extreme right. He kind of got his name out there. People didn't know who he was before, but because he'd now been arrested and he used this platform to then produce this speech, a lot of people were like, oh, okay, we know who Adolf Hitler is now. At the same time, the Nazi Party was actually banned. So he's got he's got a few things he's going to have a look at. Ludendorff wasn't even sent to prison. They just kind of had his statement, accepted it, and he kind of got away with it, and that was it. Hitler was sentenced to prison. He was sentenced to 5 years, but he actually only served 9 months. And when I say he was in prison, he had people come and visit him. He wrote a book, Mein Kampf. We see pictures of him in this prison, and he looks very comfortable and not at all like he's in prison at all. And a lot of the judges were right wing, which is kind of why we think he got so little, because he tried to have a revolution, and here we have that actually he's just given 9 months to serve in prison, which is nothing when you've got the communist revolution and we've got the leaders dead and a lot more people killed. So, can you do the same? Either make your notes or you can answer the full questions, but explain why the Nazis wanted to overthrow the Weimar Republic, explain how they tried to take over, what were their strengths and weaknesses, how much of a threat do you think they were? Do you think they were more or less than the Spartacists and the Cap Putsch? Have a think, have a go at writing your answer. So the main consequences then of the political uprisings to Germany is, in the short term, we've got a lot of political instability, we've got a lot of uprisings. Imagine if you were a person just living in Germany and you've got all these threats come in, you're being asked to help, you're being told you're a target. It's very difficult to really know where you stand. There was lots of challenges to democracy. So this is the first time Germany's become a republic, getting this republic democratic government, but all we're seeing from it is a lot of chaos, a lot of violence. There's a lot of economic instability because of the Treaty of Versailles and the amount of money that they owed, which led to a lot more hardships after the war. So people of Germany are really not quite happy, and because they're not happy, because they feel like this is the democracy and this democracy is not working, we get the rise of extremist groups, because we get the communists and the nationalists offering up a different way to tackle this, offering up a different political way of life, and people are starting to listen because they're so unhappy with the current way. Okay, in the long term, it kind of harmed people's confidence in democracy and the Weimar Republic, because they felt that they had to rely on the right to defeat the left, but then they were relying on the left, the workers, to defeat the right. So they were kind of playing each other. And extremism never went away. It was always bubbling just below the surface throughout the 1920s. And the Free Corps they gave that idea of an armed section for Hitler. That was kind of the problem with them. But overall, we're seeing that not many people are loyal to this new democracy. A lot of hatred, particularly from the right and the army, towards the Treaty of Versailles, and that's not going to go away. That bitterness and resentment is going to stay there. The extreme left, they're never going to forgive the Republic for using the army to kill so many of them, particularly when they're going to see how they've responded to the right and the fact that they've not really used much bloodshed there. That's going to cause a lot of problems. And the fact that the army decided to refuse to help the government during the Cap Putsch, again, that causes problems and a lot of insecurity. So there's an awful lot of consequences to these political uprisings, and it doesn't look great for Weimar Germany. So out of all of them, who do you think then posed the biggest threat? So do you think it was the Cap Putsch, the Munich Putsch, or the Spartacist uprising? Who do you think posed the biggest threat to the government, and why? So have a think, maybe try and think about those long and short term consequences. Who do you think posed that biggest threat? Have a go and write your answer down. So our final quiz, we've got 7. Oh, I've been a bit mean, haven't I? We've had 5 all the way through, and now I'm throwing you with 7. So have a go at answering these 7 questions from what we've done today in this lesson. So pause video, have a go at answering those 7. Hopefully you got them all right. So which right-wing group attempted to overthrow the German government in 1920? It was Wolfgang Cap and the Free Corps. How did the government stop the attempt? Eber called a general strike in Berlin. Without cooperation, the revolt actually failed. What did the leaders of the revolt want? They wanted a return to Imperial Germany, to have a king, a monarchy. When did Hitler attempt to seize power? It was November. You might have put 8th and 9th, that would be great. 1923. What inspired Hitler? It was Mussolini's fascist takeover in Italy, the March on Rome and hyperinflation. What happened to Hitler after his attempt? Failed. Hitler was sentenced to prison and the Nazi Party was banned. And what was his attempt called? The Munich Putsch or the Bielefeld Putsch? So that brings us to the end of the lesson, and actually that's the last lesson of history for now, because it's the summer holidays. Hopefully you have a wonderful summer holidays, you have a safe break, you enjoy it, try and see some friends, obviously social distance, but I can't wait to see you. I've had a meeting today with the history department and we're all very excited to get back in school and started and start this GCSE course with you all. So we're very excited to see who we've got, but also just to get started on it all. So have a safe summer. If you've got any questions or you want to show me any of your work, please do email at me, sedwards@johnfernley.org, and I'll be happy to have a look and respond. But otherwise, stay safe, take care, and we'll see you all very soon. Bye.